Folks, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. Everywhere you go, except for perhaps in southern Arizona, out in the desert. I'm going to relate a very strange little story. Since it is Christmas, and this ties in with the whole Jesus thing. If you'll forgive me for putting it that way. But this is a true story. It comes from when I was a teenager. Let's see, I would have been about 17 years old. One night, I went to bed and had a very sound sleep and was having a very, very deep dream where this was in St. Louis, Missouri, and I found myself walking across the campus in the dream, walking across the campus of the, let's see, it would have been, it's called Washington University in St. Louis. Quite a large campus, actually. Kind of a Ivy League type a brick and sandstone buildings, lots of ivy, nice landscaping throughout, lots of big old hardwood trees. Pretty old university, actually, and quite highly regarded to this day. Washington University. I used to, when I lived pretty darn close to WashU, we'd ride our bikes over there because it was a nice, safe place to cruise around on our bikes when we were younger kids, like around the ages of 10, 11, 12, 13. There was a huge hill over in one corner of the campus, a gigantic hill, steep hill, that was about, a good 50 yards long. We called it Suicide Hill. And in the winter, when it would snow, when we'd get some pretty good snows and or ice, we'd head over there with our sleds. And it was a riot, man. It was a great hill to sled on. Old Suicide Hill. But in my dream, I was walking across the campus, and what was kind of peculiar about it was, if you know what flagstones are, people use them in their gardens. They're just thin, flat stones. A lot of times people just use them as a decorative feature, but they're actually quite functional as well. You can put them at intervals to create a pathway from one part of your garden or one part of your yard to another part of your yard. And you'll always have a place to step, onto a stone that's not, either in the grass or in the mud or whatever, and you can create a nice pathway through the garden or through the yard, or so I was walking on these stones step by step by step, but at the same time I realized I was actually way out in the middle of the campus of Washington University. And suddenly I noticed something down at my feet on one of the stones. And up until this point, the whole dream had been just sort of lackluster. There wasn't anything whatsoever going on that was unusual or noteworthy of any kind. I was just walking along on these stones. Then I saw this object down on one of the stones, and I bent over and I reached down to pick it up, and I realized that as I was reaching for it with my hand, I realized that it was a crucifix. And it was very small. maybe only about this big, maybe an inch long, tiny little silver crucifix that had like wood inlaid into the middle of it. The silver surrounding a cross made of wood, and there was a Jesus figurine that was nailed to the wooden part, a tiny little a figure of Jesus, nailed to the cross, the wooden part of the cross. But this thing was very small, very, very, very tiny. And I reached down to pick it up out of sheer unbridled curiosity. The very moment my fingers touched the crucifix, there was an explosion in the dream, a complete transformation of the entire dreamscape. Suddenly, my dream became full color, technicolor, and it turned into like a lucid dream. Everything became marvelously alive. I was very aware of myself, standing in the middle of this technicolor dreamscape in the middle of the Washington University campus, and I'm holding this cross, and I just feel wonderful. I feel so wonderful in the dream, and the colors in the dream were just completely, indescribable. Very much like the colors that are reported from people who do astral traveling, or have experiences like that. Now, many of us have had dreams where we were dreaming in color. I've had dreams where I dream in black and white, or what appears to be mostly black and white, just very drab, dull colors. But then, of course, we've all had dreams where, for whatever reason, we become aware in our dream that we're dreaming, that something's different about the dream, because we're dreaming in full color. And I mean, these colors were just really a lot of colors that don't even exist, that I know of here on Earth. They were suffused with light and energy and shades and tones and colors in between colors. It was that kind of thing. And then in the next instant, the dream was over. That was it. But I do remember looking at this little crucifix in the dream. I wasn't even questioning what it was or what its meaning was. I was just simply looking at it and was holding it in my hand, which I find kind of interesting, that I wasn't like curious. In my dream, I wasn't even curious about what it meant or what it was. It was just sort of, wow, there it was. And of course, I was simultaneously overwhelmed by the whole change in the dream. The dreamscape had become so alive, and that was it. Fast forward to within the next couple of days, I was putzing around. I think I was in my room, which was on the third floor of this old Victorian house that we used to live in back in St. Louis. It had a third floor, a walk-up attic. Had circular stairs that went up into the attic. The attic was tiny, but it had all these closets that were covered over with knotty pine, old knotty pine doors and planks. Old. I mean, the knotty pine was 100 years old, so it had time to mellow down to this beautiful sort of dark orangey amber kind of color, with big knots in the pine wood, and all kinds of closet spaces all around the room, and had gables on both sides that headed out with windows looking out through the roof. It was a very magical place for a 17-year-old kid to call his room, his bedroom. So anyway, I'm there. One day, I can't remember how many days it might have been after I had this wild dream. But I was looking for something in my wallet. I always used to carry a leather wallet, like all kids, Kept some cash in there, and maybe some kind of ID card. I didn't use my own credit cards back then, but of course, since I was past 16, I would have had my driver's license in there for sure. But some cash and things of that kind. But I'm looking through my wallet, and I felt a strange lump deep down in one of the pockets of the wallet. I could feel it with my thumb. I could feel a big, lumpy little thing in there. I thought, what the hell is that? So I dug down in there, and I reached down in there, and I pulled this thing out of there. It was a crucifix. It was a little silver crucifix with a wooden part, a wooden cross that was inlaid into the front part of the crucifix, attached to the silver somehow, and a Jesus figurine, very finely made, a very small figure of Jesus, with little tiny itty bitty actual real nails going through his wrists into the wood, and a little tiny nail going through the tops of his ankles, into the bottom part of the wood, and that's when I remembered my dream. At that instant, when I took that crucifix out of my wallet, that's the very, very moment that I remembered the dream that I had where everything had turned like full technicolor, almost psychedelic. The very moment that I picked the crucifix up off of the flagstone on the ground, the moment my hand touched it, I had that dream experience. And here I am pulling a crucifix out of my wallet. And it couldn't have been that much longer after I'd had the dream, because I made the immediate connection between a remembrance of the dream and the crucifix in my hand that I had just taken out from my wallet. True story, folks. True story. I was so gobsmacked by that, by finding that little crucifix, and then remembering the dream. I was so astounded by the whole thing, and not sure what it meant at all. But I vowed to keep the crucifix in my wallet, like forever. And I stuck it way back down, deep down in that little leather pocket in my wallet, and I could feel it in there. And it stayed in there for the longest time, and I would always check on it, from time to time, just to see if I could feel that little lump there. And it stayed in my wallet for, I don't know, I don't know how long exactly. I think I probably used that wallet for a couple of years, before it fell apart. But that little crucifix stayed in there. And every once in a while, I'd pull it out and look at it and just marvel at it. Then I thought of it one day and went to check on it, and it was gone. It wasn't there anymore. It had simply vanished. Don't remember anything unusual that I had done with my wallet. Don't remember anything that had happened where my wallet might have fallen out of my pocket or got left in a pair of shorts and washed in the washing machine. There was nothing that I could point to and say, well, this must be the reason why it's not in there anymore. I must have lost it somehow. But nope, there was nothing like that. I was so mystified by the crucifix disappearing that I actually asked my mother about it, because it had occurred to me much earlier. It did occur to me that maybe she was just sort of messing with me, that she might have placed that crucifix in my wallet of her own doing. You can possibly speculate as to why a mother might have done that for her son. We don't know. But she knew nothing about it. And she swears that she did not take anything out of my wallet. And I remember that. I remember her saying that she didn't remove anything from my wallet. So I had to cling to the conclusion that the whole disappearance of the crucifix was just going to have to remain unexplained. Many years later, I decided to see if I could shop around online and find a similar crucifix, something that kind of reminded me of that original one. See if such things actually existed in the world. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go get something. I will be right back. Don't go away, people. Moving slow these days, moving slow. It's got some Italian written on the back of it. Let's see, it says, Tre Fontaine, Roma. And then it says, Pipi Trappisti. I think that's a person's name. And then, Tre Fontaine, Roma. And I happen to know that this little screw comes out and the back of it opens up, and it contains a little piece of wood right here. Which is alleged to be a piece of the original cross of Jesus. Of course, it is symbolic in nature. And I'm taking this screwing the back plate back together. This little object is very, very similar, but not identical, but very, very similar to the cross that I found on the flagstone in my dream. Very similar. And I kept that little cross. The one I had was not quite this thick. It was flatter than this by a good margin. And the Jesus was a little different. But, you know, the hands and the feet on my cross had little bitty tiny nails that were hammered through onto the central piece of wood, which this appears to also have. The silver appears to hold the crucifix itself, made out of wood. And of course, this little feature up here indicates that this was meant to be worn around the neck, more than likely. But I found this somewhere online. Oh, I'm going to say 30 years ago. Because I had been thinking about that dream I'd had 60 years ago when I was a teenager. And I got to wondering, no, it couldn't have been 30 years ago because we didn't really have computers and online shopping that long ago. So maybe it was more like 20 years ago, perhaps, 25. But it wasn't much less than that. But somehow I found this thing somewhere and purchased it. What do you think of that, folks? I don't know what to make of it all. As a footnote to the whole story, I will not fail to mention that I actually do not consider myself Christian. However, having said that, I regard Jesus Christ as in the same way that I regard so many other great saints, especially those that lived around India and in China centuries ago, even into the modern age. Many, many saints who were extraordinary beings. Many of them had what we call in Hindi, many of them had siddhis. Siddhis translates, I guess, loosely as powers. Many saints from India have been endowed with powers that were every single bit as profound as those that Jesus Christ was alleged to have used on many occasions. Now, that may come as blasphemy to some of you out there. And if you ask me whether I give a shit, I would reply, No, I don't. The reason I don't give a shit is because I know of several modern, they're deceased now, but several modern saints who lived in the 20th century, um, to whom were attributed many, many miracles. And if one cannot accept the possibility that such miracles could possibly have been within the powers of a modern saint, you know, and if people who are call themselves Christian feel threatened when they hear that there might have been modern saints who could do the same things that Jesus could do, well, that's just most unfortunate for you, isn't it now? Most unfortunate. Too bad. I know a lot of Christians are quick to condemn people who are deeply involved in, shall we say, Eastern forms of religion, including Hinduism and a number of its sects and branches. Hinduism, not to mention Buddhism. Now in Hinduism, of course, we have the fundamental concept of God and the acceptance of the existence of God with a capital G. But at the same time, in Hinduism, we have countless incarnations of God. Countless incarnations. In other words, different forms of God. Of course, in Christianity, the only incarnation of God that they will accept and acknowledge as legitimate would, of course, be Jesus. He would be the only incarnation of God that they would accept as being part and parcel of God, being his only son, only begotten son, meaning that he was the only incarnation of God that would be considered to be legitimate and for real. I do not subscribe to that manner of thinking whatsoever. I think that there have been many throughout history incarnations of God, saints, highly advanced and enlightened beings who have healed the sick, helped the poor, created food with their bare hands, created food to feed large groups of people. That is not a power that Jesus alone was in command of. There are modern examples of that happening. I know of several that were documented back in the 60s and 70s of the 20th century. So, the dream I had, where everything went sort of psychedelic the moment I touched the crucifix in my dream. I don't know, I find that kind of interesting. What's the takeaway? I have to ask myself, what was the takeaway? I was only about 17 years old. The dream did affect me on a pretty deep level. And I remember thinking to myself, that perhaps Jesus might be someone I should investigate more deeply as far as my own spiritual work was concerned. And I actually did, to some extent. I confess. I did some readings. I was not so much into the Bible, but I did read a little bit of the Bible. But I read some of the works of Thomas Merton and some other, religious, theological scholars back in my late teenage years. But I also continued to read a lot on Buddhism and Hinduism. So, there are academics, biblical scholars, who have written entire books based upon the fundamental premise that Jesus was not himself an historical figure. There was no figure known as Jesus who was a great saint with great powers and so forth, who lived at the time he is alleged to have lived. There are some academics who have done a very, very deep dive on that topic, very deep dive into the history and the underpinnings of Christianity. And of course, as many of us actually know, nothing apparently was put down on paper. Nothing was written about the life of Jesus Christ, or the alleged life of Jesus Christ. Nothing was written down or enumerated until about 300 years after he allegedly lived. That's a long time. 300 years, before anybody chose to write any kind of biographical material about the life of Jesus and the things that he may have done or not done. That's kind of unusual. But, it's a very, very intricate, very sticky concept to try to maintain intellectually and factually. One really needs to have one's ducks in a row in terms of historical facts, which could easily comprise some very intense and very obscure and archaic manuscripts and writings from in and around the time of Jesus. But here again, there are some biblical scholars and academics who have done exactly that, have taken it upon themselves to try to determine how much truth there is to the how much truth there is to support the idea of a historical Jesus having lived right around zero modern Christian era, so to speak, or into the very early years of the modern Christian era. So it's all very interesting to me. Having said all of that, as I indicated earlier, I consider Jesus if there had been an historical Jesus, he was way more than likely to have been just another incarnation of God in the sort of Hindu sense. He was he was capable of great siddhis, or powers, spiritual powers that are usually left only for those who have attained an extremely, extremely high and exalted spiritual state. And there are only, 3 or 4 handfuls of such incarnations that I am confident I could point to and say, yep, they're it. They're the ones. They are the ones. One of such beings, one among such beings, was my own guru, who lived from probably around the turn of the century, 1900-ish, to 1973, at which time he is said to have taken his samadhi, which means in India that means he allowed his incarnation to terminate itself, and he died, and was his body was ceremonially burned on a funeral pyre in the traditional manner, such as is done in quite routinely in India, although not universally so. Some great saints are actually buried. They're not cremated, they're actually buried. They leave the body intact and bury it somewhere in some special place. But in this particular instance, all of the folks who were his closest devotees mutually decided that he should be cremated and his ashes interred amongst at least a little bit amongst all of his temples that he had founded. He founded scores and scores of temples all around, mostly northern India. How many temples, I'm not sure, but quite a few. And most of those temples are dedicated to the great incarnation of God known as Hanuman, or the monkey god. My guru, his name was Neem Karoli Baba, and he passed in 73 on September 11th of 1973, strangely enough, and was cremated, and his ashes spread around. He has been seen numerous times by many different folks who were among either his devotees at the time or just happened to know him, and in some instances people completely unrelated to him. He is known to have appeared to and even spent time hanging out with certain individuals in a human body that looked just like his regular body before he died. These I know this sounds insane. I know that it sounds like fantasy and just a complete bullshit to a lot of you folks out there. I can absolutely promise you 100% that these anecdotes of Maharaji, as we would call him, Maharaji, Neem Karoli Baba. Neem Karoli Baba was also known as Maharaji. Maharaji actually translates as great king. Great king. Just a term of endearment that was very common over in India. Still is to this day, actually. But Maharaji was known to have appeared to many, many people. Even as recently as in the 2000s here, where he appeared in a hospital room with a woman who had never been to India. She only found out about Maharaji through a book that someone gave her about Maharaji, and she must have had some deep connection that transcended her present birth, her present incarnation. She was probably connected to Maharaji in previous births, in her own past, and but she became so attached to Baba that there was just no question of who she considered her guru. And she was just sort of like a regular housewife. She wasn't like into any of this kind of stuff. But it's a very strange story, actually. But she got sick with cancer, and it turns out she had terminal cancer and was dying in a hospital in Kansas City, as I recall. Kansas City, Missouri, or Kansas City, Kansas, I'm not sure which. But she'd been there for weeks. She was slowly dying and was completely bedridden, but she it was known that she had become like an instantaneous overnight devotee of Neem Karoli Baba. And then suddenly, one day, a strange individual started showing up at her hospital room. And they had visiting hours. And so it was totally legal and, permitted for people to visit for hours at a time. But so this fellow started staying in her room with her for entire days at a time, and he refused to leave at night. He stayed with her, if I remember the story the way it is told, he stayed with her for a couple of weeks, refused to leave the room. And he, at one point, not long after he arrived on the scene, the nurses were talking, and one of them asked the other one, "Who is that guy in there? Is it he might, And of course he looked just like Maharaji does in his final years, kind of a rotund old man with a short whitish beard, a heavy mustache, totally bald, and wearing a blanket wrapped around him, and some kind of a loincloth, or some undergarments. One of the nurses thought, well, he kind of reminds me of a rabbi. I think she's probably Jewish, and this is just some rabbi that has been coming to keep a vigil at her bedside, or so it was speculated. But they weren't sure who this guy was. It's amazing to think, and this was only like around the year 2000 or so when this happened. There was no investigation into who this guy was that suddenly showed up on the scene hanging out with this woman who was terminally ill. But he stayed there, sat in a chair, and he appeared to just go into deep meditation deep, deep meditations for many, many hours on end and just hang out with her day after day after day. Then finally one day, before she actually had died, she was still alive, but finally one day he just vanished. He just disappeared. He was gone. Of course, it was only very shortly thereafter that she actually did pass. That's a fascinating story, man. You can't make this shit up. Fascinating story. I have several things that have happened in my own life that I fully attribute to Maharaji. I finally had my mind completely and fully and irreversibly blown when I became 100%, shall we say, in the pocket of Maharaji. In Maharaji's hip pocket, which occurred in 1981, I might add. Even though I first met him through Ram Dass's book, Be Here Now, which the publication of which was first released, I think, in 1971 or 72. And he had a couple or three different photos of Maharaji in the opening text, and he told some stories about how he met Maharaji in India when he went to India, which I believe must have been around 1968 or 69, and that was sort of the springboard for the development of the rest of the book, which really was a sort of a spiritual how-to manual, a manual for spiritual growth and things that one could do to try to create some conditions whereby one might progress on the spiritual path. Things pertaining to diet, spiritual practices, yoga, meditation, etc. But that's where I first met Maharaji. But even though I thought the whole Ram Dass thing was quite fascinating and quite profound, it didn't grab me by the heart. Even though I was quite captivated with the whole spiritual scene, it just didn't grab me by the heart. That was not to happen till about 10 years later, when Ram Dass published his book, Miracle of Love, which was a collection of over 1,000 stories about Maharaji, collected from hundreds of devotees and hundreds of individuals in India, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly from devotees in India who had had experiences with him that were, in many, many cases, nothing short of amazing and profound. And so, who was Jesus? Who was Jesus? What is Christmas? What is Jesus? Who is Jesus? Jesus the Christ. Maharaji himself, back in the 70s, was asked about how Jesus um, how Jesus meditated. What did Jesus do when he meditated? And suddenly Maharaji, who would not normally answer such a question with any kind of verbiage, you know, but the question was one that just kind of stopped him in his tracks. And he went into an instantaneous samadhi. And what that means in India is that he suddenly entered an exalted spiritual state spontaneously, and he just went out, and tears were streaming down his cheeks, and he was out of commission for a good little while there. And I don't know how long exactly. I don't think it was a real long period of time, but it was certainly probably at least 5 or 10 minutes. He was lost in a completely exalted state. And when he finally returned, he just simply said, he lost himself in love. He lost himself in love. That's how Jesus meditated. Really, at the end of the day, it's all one and the same. It's all one and the same. If Maharaji's reaction to the question, how did Jesus meditate? What did he do when he meditated? If Maharaji's reaction to that question can be taken to heart, taken at face value, shall we say, it would seem to imply quite clearly that yes, indeed, there was for sure, and without a doubt, a Jesus in this world who was yet another incarnation of God and a great saint in his own right, as we all tend to believe in varying degrees, needless to say. But Maharaji's reaction to the question, which was simply to immediately enter an extremely exalted spiritual state for quite a number of minutes, would suggest that, yes, you don't need to worry. There really was a Jesus, and he was every bit as spiritually advanced And as much as I don't like to use such words, but he was every bit as much spiritually advanced as Maharaji is or was, and as any other saints were. And so all of this talk about whether or not Jesus was an historical figure, I don't know what to make of any of that stuff, to be quite honest with you. I don't know what to make of it. Because there are some scholars who absolutely insist from their research that there was no such thing as an historical Jesus. That it grew, the apparent personality of Jesus was actually an outgrowth of other trends, or was an amalgamation of other figures in history around that time, other prophets and or healers or saints or whatever, and that the Jesus figure was sort of the essence of several different individuals all rolled up into one apparent person. There are all kinds of theories like this out there. I'm not going to worry my head about them. Merry Christmas, everybody. Merry Christmas. Blessings I pass along to each and every one of you. Blessings for peace within your hearts, enough to eat, suitable shelter, and so forth and so on.